all you can build is a one-family home. If you're in area zone U2, you have more choices. You can build a one-family home or a two-family home. If you're in area zone U3, you have three choices: one-family home, two-family home, or apartment complex, right? So as you go up the ladder, so to speak, you have more choices. In U6, you can do whatever you want. Don't forget, though, nuisance doctrine, and this comes into play. Think of the feedlot case, Spur versus Del Webb. If you have an area that's zoned for a sewage dump and you build an apartment complex next door to it, you might be liable for nuisance, right? So even if the zoning code would permit the construction of a one-family home in a certain area, that doesn't mean it's actually prudent to build a one-family home in that spot. Okay? Good? Okay. The next, let me just reload this 1 second. The next type of district we have is called the height district, which we didn't talk too much about, but I'll talk about it now. The height district. Okay, what does that mean? Depending which district you're in, your building can be of a certain height. If you're in what's called H1, you have at 35 feet max. Well, if you're in H2, well, you can have a 10-foot house, a 20-foot house, a 30-foot house, all the way up to 50 feet. And then if you're in H3, you can have up to 80 feet or even anything less than that. Again, usually the highest number here includes everything below it. So it doesn't have to be exactly 80 feet. It has to be up to 80 feet. All right. The last one's a little bit trickier because the numbers seem to be inverted. These are called the area usages, right? Which usually measures how big a property must be, right? How big a structure must be. So if you're in an area that's zoned A4, you have to have at least a 900 square foot property, right? That's not very big. Most apartments are 1,000 square feet, so that's actually a fairly small spot. If you're in an area zoned A3, about 1,250 square feet, right? It's got to be a little bit bigger, and then so on, all the way up to A1's 5,000 square feet. As a general matter, the one-family houses are going to require more square footage, right? They're required to be bigger, and two-family houses are a little bit smaller. This doesn't map up perfectly with the use districts, but they often will. Right? With me so far? All right, now I want you to think about how these three types of districts overlap and work with each other, right? So imagine you're zoned U1 with a height 1 and A4. What that means is you can only build a one-family home, no more than 35 feet. That's be really wide, 5,000 square feet, right? Can't go up, can go wide. That requires you to use a lot more space. Now, keep in mind that most property regimes also have what are called offsets or set-offs, right? Your house must be a certain number of feet from the curb, and must be a certain number of feet from the property line next to you on each side, and you have a backyard of a certain size. What that means is you need to have 5,000 square feet for the house itself and a lot of green surrounding you. That makes lot sizes very big and very expensive. There's a lot of wasted space that you may not need. So again, the effect of these zoning regimes is to make houses bigger, further apart, and more expensive, as by design. That's not a bug. That's a feature of the system. Okay. Does that all make sense? Zach, you got a hand? That's okay. Okay.
I'm curious, how do they uphold, like, how do courts uphold these size requirements? Like, what's the rationale of, like, how does anyone suffer from a smaller structure? Like, how do you justify that?
Well, look. So I'll answer your question in the abstract, and I'll answer it for real. Okay. In the abstract, you don't want people being crowded. So you might imagine that if you have a family, however that's defined, they should be living in a spot that's bigger than 1,000 square feet. And of course, not all families can afford to live in such a big spot, right? But the idea is we don't want people being crowded. Difficulty, though, is families are often might have a family with 2 kids or 1 kid or no kids or a dozen kids. So these are very blunt instruments how they do zoning. It's not exactly sort of art, a precise art. The real answer is the review by courts is very deferential. Courts apply something like the rational basis test, and if there's some reasonable basis to argue that that's okay, then that's probably enough for the courts. That's your question? You're not happy with it though.
I can understand, like, if it's a town, like you said, where it's applied like equally across the town? I just don't understand like in a city where different how the like you just say that one family deserves different space and another one does. Like they're not safe and like in the same.
Right. So if it's an apartment complex, they can be squeezed together like sardines, but if it's a one family zone, they have to be spread out. Is that what your question is?
I get that. I mind. I'll figure it out. I'm just
Verbalize?
verbalize.
Verbalize. Okay. Okay. Questions on the use area and height districts? All right. And again, 1 second, Casey. And again, don't forget about the set-offs, right? This comes up in our case today. If your lot must be a certain size and you need to have a certain number of feet surrounding your lot, it may be possible you can't build anything. Right? That's actually the subject of our case today, right? Depending on the dimensions of your lot, if there must be a minimum house size plus feet surrounding it, you can't build anything. The land becomes useless. So zoning can often render land completely irrelevant. Casey. Who lives on golf courses?
No, like a lot of people like most of where I live at, like there's a whole golf course of people that houses on the back
Really?
of the golf.
Okay.
So and then like it's a big city kingdom, so then people will live on the water.
Right.
So we talk about like usage. You may have a house or height. You may have a house that's extremely small, that's skinny, that goes up very high, and a stretched out house. And how do they decide if one
If one of them what?
you want to build a dock for your usage of it? Is that something that's inside usage also?
Right. So I'm just going to go on a limb and say that zoning by water is very tricky, and it's designed specifically for that. In terms of a golf course, do people like hit balls into the windows and stuff?
Yeah.
But they live there anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a whole certain neighborhood. It's entire whole like houses.
Okay. I don't get.
If you live on the golf course, you actually can't put up a wooden fence. Like they built a black iron fence, you can't put up a wooden
Yes,
fence.
everyone's fence is wide open, so
The balls can go flying.
Yeah. They have windows.
Sounds like an easement to me.
They have what?
There's certain windows.
They're shatterproof. Oh, that's good. Happy Gilmore, right? Yeah. The movie actually aged pretty well. I saw it recently. It wasn't terrible. All right. Yeah, I don't know, but I expect it has specific zoning codes to permit that because usually you can't have a house on a golf course. But I guess where is this? Not sure. I don't know what that is. Okay. Oh, is that right? Okay. I've never been I've been mini golfing. Golf. Okay. Questions on this? All right. Let's move on. So the theme. I'll choose one question. Make sure we all get this one right. Please get this one right. Question number 1, please. Get this one wrong, I will not be happy. Okay. A developer can build a one-family home in land that is zoned U6. True or false? Okay, another 10 seconds. Okay, stop right there. Got 100%. Let's see if we got 100%. Oh, come on. I just said this one. How can a court if you get this one wrong? God, I don't even know. I said this not even 3 minutes ago. What am I supposed to do? I don't supposed to do. You really don't know. Is that what you thought, Casey? Did you get this one right? Okay, good for you. Oh, is that right? Did anyone else see it that way? Zach, do you get it right?
I got it right, but with respect, they're clearly screwing with you.
The clue what?
The class is clearly screwing with you.
Is that why they're doing it?
I promise you it is.
That's a bold assumption, right?
I really want to do that. That doesn't bode well for someone who has. Thank God for blind grading. Okay. All right. You didn't get this one wrong. Just rewind the class. All right. So the topic then for today is how to make zoning more flexible. Zoning is generally very rigid, right? You have these area districts, you have these use districts, you have these height districts. And if you're 6 inches over a boundary line, you don't get to build. If your house is 1 square foot too little, you don't get to build. If your house is 1 inch too tall, you don't get to build. But over time, governments have developed ways of generating flexibility, right? Generating flexibility. Okay. So one of these concepts that creates some flexibility is the idea of a pre-existing non-conforming use. A pre-existing non-conforming use. Okay, now let's break that word down, right? What does that mean? So what does pre-existing mean? It refers to some construction that existed before, that is prior to, a zoning ordinance, right? Zoning laws are changed all the time. And when there's a new zoning law, it's not required that everything must come into compliance right away, right? Some uses pre-existed the zoning ordinance, and they can remain, at least for some time. We'll talk about that in a few moments, right? But a pre-existing non-conforming use is some construction, some building that existed before the zoning ordinance. What does non-conforming mean? What does non-conforming mean? It means it does not conform, that is does not comply with the zoning law. Okay, a non-conforming use. A non-conforming use does not conform, does not comply with a zoning ordinance. Why is it important to have a pre-existing non-conforming use? Because under the law, you are grandfathered. Right? What does it mean to be grandfathered? You maintain that status for some time, right? You can keep your non-conforming use for at least some period of time. That's a very valuable asset because now you're the only one in the block who can potentially do that or have that kind of use. A non-conforming use can be handed from one person to another. So if I have a non-conforming use that's grandfathered and I sell Blackacre, the person who buys it can likewise benefit from that. It runs with the land, so to speak. Now, a non-conforming use is not indefinite. If you make certain substantial changes to your property, you can lose your grandfather status, right? So if you do substantial renovations and you change everything, right, you might lose your status. If you decide to change your business, let's say it was a restaurant, you turn into a factory, right? You're gonna probably lose your status. There's always contests about whether you can keep your grandfather status. I'll give you an example. When I had a case I had many years ago. Let's say you have a garbage dump in the middle of a city, right? That was been there for 100 years. Okay, it's grandfathered in. And let's say the garbage dump switches from disposing garbage to recycling, right? Is that close enough to the original purpose to maintain the grandfather use? Or is that a substantial departure that would result in the grandfather status being revoked, right? And I don't even remember how the case turned out. It's actually very important. But these are things people litigate over, right? Do you get to keep your non-conforming use if there's been a change? The book mentioned a restaurant in Brooklyn called Lundy's, right? I've eaten. It's a good place. It was a restaurant that was dormant for like 15 or 20 years. And they said, restaurant again. We keep our non-conforming usage. And New York's like, no, you can't do that. That's not going to work. Okay. Now, what happens if you have a non-conforming use and you lose your grandfather status? You have to come into compliance with the law, right? You must come into compliance with the law. So maybe it's something easy. Maybe you can just fix it by installing, maybe new lighting, or maybe you could install a handicap ramp, whatever happens to be, right? You can do something small. What if you can't, right? What happens if you had a grandfather status and you lost it, and now your lot is too big, right? Your house is too big for your lot. You don't have enough frontage. You're sort of stuck, right? All you can do is maybe chop off parts of your house, or maybe buy land from a neighbor, right? Your options are somewhat limited. Right? Now, there's also a concept of what happens if the government changes the policy, but they don't want you keeping your grandfather's clause, right? Are you required to give people grandfather status? And generally, the answer is not. Pennsylvania might be an outlier in this front. Because we have this concept called amortization, right? What's amortization? Amortization means you give a property owner a limited period of time, whatever that happens to be, to come into compliance. If they fail to come into compliance, then they're violating the law. You can get an injunction, hold them in contempt, and so on. And if they come into compliance, great, we're done, right? Good. But why is amortization controversial? We generally have a principle in our legal system that we don't change the law after the fact. So you probably studied in criminal law, maybe, or con law, the ex post facto clause of the Constitution, right? The ex post facto clause only governs criminal, does not govern civil, right? So imagine you commit a crime, you do an act, and then the very next day they pass a law banning what you did, right? If the law was not in effect at the time of your action, you can't be criminalized for it, prosecuted for it, right? We presume that ignorance of the law is no excuse. The flip side of that maxim is that the law must be clear. The law cannot be changed after the fact. It would violate the ex post facto clause, probably also the due process clause as well. Right, I'll give you a very recent example. Alec Baldwin, you may have seen, had an accident or something like that in New Mexico where he shot someone. He claims he didn't pull the trigger. We'll leave that aside for a moment, right? I have no love lost for Alec Baldwin, but I do love the ex post facto clause. So after he shot a person, New Mexico changed the law, and they created an enhancement for that specific type of crime to have more time in jail. And the prosecutor, bless her heart, charged Alec Baldwin with a statute that was enacted after his action occurred. No good. So his lawyer filed a motion to dismiss that part of the indictment, and the lawyer first said, "Oh, these New York lawyers, blah 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 blah," right? And then she's like, yeah, never mind. We're not going to charge him with that part." So what could have been, I think, between 5 and 10 years in prison is down to about 18 months. So this principle matters, right? That you can't change law after the fact. Yes, Patricia. Yeah, doesn't it? Doesn't it? The lawyering there is not very good. So in fairness, a friend of mine is actually one of Baldwin's attorneys, so I have a stake in this. Not a stake, but I've been following it closely. But the attorneys there are doing a very poor job. That he might walk. And again, I have no love lost for Alec Baldwin. I've just the guy. You ever see Team America World Police? That. Anyway, that's situation very basic. I think that's a very anyway. I think they just forgot. They literally just went through the statutes. Oh, there's a statute. Let's use that one. They forgot to check what date it was enacted. This is a prosecutor. They don't bill out. This is government lawyers. This is a government attorney. This is a prosecutor. This is not billable hours. And in fact, there's another issue because one of the prosecutors is actually a member of the state legislature, and there's some separation of powers issues having a member of the state legislature serving as a prosecutor. Anyway, the case is just it's unfortunate that anyway. But if you look at these New York lawyers and they start making fun of them, they get dismissed indictment the next day in part. Not dismiss, they dismiss that enhancement. It's bad. All right. So anyway, the problem with amortization though is money, right? So if the government says you are required to shut down your business tomorrow, I think everyone would agree that's a taking. You got to pay compensation. And if the government says, you know what, if in the next 50 years you can wind down your business, I think most people would say, well, that's not the end of the world, right? 50 years is a long time. Is a community required to have a non-conforming use forever? can a community try to sort of bring people together in a similar comprehensive plan over a period of time? So what if it's not 50 years? What if it's 5 years, 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, and so on, right? Is there some point where an amortization period is unconstitutional? Does it violate the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment? And that's the theme of the first case today, the Pennsylvania Northwest Distributors case, right, which concerns the appropriate length of an amortization period. One other word, confiscatory, right? You'll see this word in the reading. Confiscatory is kind of like confiscate, which means to take. It's a taking, right? If a government policy is confiscatory, it means it's a taking. And let me just throw more vocabulary at you, if I may. Per se confiscatory or per se taking. You'll see both. Per se. What does per se mean? On its face, by law, whatever you want to call it, right? It means automatic. If you do certain things, it is a per se taking or it's per se confiscatory. You'll see these phrases everywhere. All right, good. I want to give you the facts in Pennsylvania Northwest. Go ahead.
So in 1985, the plaintiff, which was Pennsylvania Northwest Distributors, they opened an adult bookstore in a town called.
And just for those who maybe are a little bit younger, adult bookstore means pornography store. They're not selling like adult novels. Just I have to just clarify that point. I have to. People in adult bookstore. My day kids think they even know what that even is. They've never been to one. They would never know what they even exists. All right, go on.
So after the bookstore opened, the town amended its zoning ordinances that imposed restrictions on the operation of adult bookstores and said that they could not be located within 500 feet of a school, park, church, and further stated they couldn't.
Let me just can I just pause you for a second? I'll come back to you in a minute. I promise. All right. So it's within 500 feet of a school, hospital, nursing home, group care facility, park, church, establishment selling alcohol, which is basically any restaurant or store or grocery or anything or gas station, right? Or another adult commercial enterprise. There's going to be virtually nowhere. Just think of any map, right? Go anywhere. There's going to be virtually nowhere in the city that actually satisfies those criteria, right? Nowhere. I'll just give you a few anecdotes. I think I told you last week the Methodist Clinic story, right, where they moved to the outskirts of town and there was nothing there. It was industrial park, right? And the city designated a strip of grass as public park to knock them out, right? If you look at any major urban area and you draw a 500 radius, nowhere. This can't exist. Now, this was in Western Pennsylvania. I used to live not too far from there, near the Pittsburgh airport. So maybe you do have some spot. It's going to be a very remote area. We have this. There's nothing's nearby. A related issue is actually changing the topic: sex offenders, right? Very often, for their condition of release, they can't live within 500 feet of a school, a park, a playground, and so on. There's nowhere for them to live, right? In any city, you're always close enough to one of those places. So they literally can't live anywhere. That's why they often live by highway underpasses because there's nowhere nearby. Another issue, criminal law. If you commit a crime, such as dealing drugs near a playground or park or so on, there's an enhancement for the penalty. That makes sense. You don't have people dealing drugs near your park. So at least where I clerked in the housing project, there were always playgrounds nearby. So virtually 100% of the drug deals in that area had the enhancement, just by virtue of where they lived. So these sort of 500 radiuses are very, very tricky. Think of New York City. They try and ban possession of guns within 500 feet of any of these places. You can't carry a gun anywhere, right? So these 500-foot rules are basically complete bans. They're not saying it on their face, but that's what they are. All right, go on. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So coincidentally, the adult bookstore was too close.
Coincidentally, no, there was no coincidence here. All right, go on.
The new ordinance gave the adult bookstore a 90-day amortization period to fix it for fire non-conforming use.
Good.
And because of the hardship of closing down a business in such a short time, the adult bookstore only had an option to close.
Good.
So plaintiff sued and found the constitutionality of the amortization period, and the trial court appeared.
I think that's amortization. Yeah, you're fine.
And the trial court and appeals court upheld the amortization period as a reasonable because they were relying on Sullivan for its use of the word reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
In the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Sullivan was reversed because the bookstore didn't violate any law, create a nuisance, or violate any covenant restriction or easement. and then it went to the Supreme Court, and they agreed. It was held the amortization period was unconstitutional, but Sullivan was not reversed. And it was held unconstitutional because it was unreasonable, because 90 days wasn't nearly enough to close a business, or close the business's contractual obligations, or liquidate their product.
Use a different word. You don't pay attention, you miss it. All right, that's good. All right, you're done. All right. I got in trouble this morning too. We need to get a variance for one of these bookstores. Anyway. So the timing here is very suspicious, very coincidental, right? On May 4th, Northwestern opens up a bookstore, right? May 4th. And the 4th be with you, right? 4 days later, the township announces they're going to have a meeting to discuss amending the zoning ordinance. I don't see a coincidence here. This is directly in response to this bookstore. And then about 2 weeks later, they hold a hearing. And you can imagine the hearing, people are clutching their pearls saying, oh, no, we can't. Oh, that's mean. I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. People are at the meeting saying, we really don't want this in our community. It will harm us. It will be degenerate. It will hurt our morality and so on. By the way, bookstores apparently still in business, right? So I guess people live there use the business. I just guessing. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. But at the time they said we can't have this here, and we need to amend our zoning ordinance, and they passed this 500-foot radius bill. And oh, by the way, you have 90 days to come to compliance. So there's no way they can come to. I mean, maybe if they, turned to a Christian bookstore and sold Bibles, they could, but with their inventory, they probably couldn't do that, right? And keep in mind, they just opened a business. Maybe they take out loans, had a line of credit, right, a mortgage or something to pay for the facility. Businesses can't just be shut down on a moment's notice. So they sued, and they argued that the amended zoning code violated the state constitution. Again, this is not a case on the U.S. Constitution; it's a case on the state constitution. Now, under the governing precedent, a case called Sullivan, the court asked whether an amortization period was reasonable. And I think we could all agree 90 days is insane, right? You just open your business, you've been in business for like 3 weeks, and now you have to shut down. You probably will take a substantial loss, and you can't ever recoup those losses. As the lower courts held, you can't have an unreasonable period for amortization. That result prevailed at the Supreme Court, right? The plaintiffs won here, but the Supreme Court went a step further. Right, the Supreme Court went a step further. The state Supreme Court said that no amortization period was ever reasonable. That the Constitution required grandfathering. Again, that no matter how long an amortization period was, it was not reasonable. The Constitution of the state required grandfather status, and apparently indefinitely. Right? Apparently, I mean, if you read the opinion, 100 years would not be enough, right? Any attempt to amortize would be unconstitutional under the state constitution. And the reason why, the court says, is that in the state of Pennsylvania, under the law, property is sacrosanct. It's very important, right? It's a very important principle, and it cannot be balanced away, right? You can't suggest that because people don't like this particular use, we need to take away their property right. Everyone get the majority? Right. The concurrence, I think, articulates what's probably the majority view. I don't think the Pennsylvania court is adopted everywhere. But the concurrence says is, okay, I agree 90 days is too short. That's not reasonable, but I would keep the Sullivan rule in place, right? The court can look to different factors to decide, if an amortization period is reasonable, right? We don't have to strike down everything all at once, right? It was a matter of degree, right? And the concurrence said we don't want to restrict the state's police power too much, right? Zoning must be flexible, right? Non-conforming uses should be able to go away. So the court would look at a couple factors. I'm sorry, the concurrence looks at a few factors. How long is the period? How long is the period in relationship to the investment? Keep in mind, the business was only there for a few weeks. They couldn't have invested, terribly much, maybe just get started. And also, how offensive is a non-conforming use? And I suppose that the bookstore is very offensive to the people living in that community. But again, the concurrence thought that getting rid of all the inventory would take too much time. I could not be done within that little time, and therefore this period was unreasonable. Yes, Casey? Well, let me ask you a question, Casey, because it actually relates to our next topic. How do you define the public interest? How would a zoning board be able to determine what's in the public interest?
Well, if they were elected or.
No, they're appointed. They're appointed.
So you're hoping that the people that are appointed live in that area and have an idea that they interact with.
Yeah, but if I pick one of your neighbors at random, would you say his view is the public interest? How would a judge know what's in the public interest, my friend? You ask it 100 times, what's in the public interest, right? How the heck's the judge supposed to know that? Maybe this judge doesn't use adult bookstores. Maybe some people do want to use bookstores.
I don't know. I guess that's I guess you just go by like what a only person is like.
I mean, again, if I put 30 people in this room asking what's in public interest, I'm not getting one answer. I might get 30 different answers. I think we're all prudent here.
I guess you would go with.
There's no answer to this question, by the way, but you can keep going.
I'm guessing like because I mean, it does sound difficult. Like, what is the public interest? I guess you would go with what a majority of people think.
Do you think a survey? Can the court put out a survey, a poll?
You don't get everyone to answer.
You don't, and people don't even pick up their phones. Does anyone actually answer the calls from the surveyors? I hang up immediately. You just click immediate. There's actually no clicking, but I guess tap. Was that?
Click and block.
Yeah, the block. The block is good. All right, but it's actually a fair point that Casey's asking, right? How do you actually know what's offensive? And invariably, there's not an answer to this question. The judge does make a judgment, right? That's what judges do. They judge. That's why they call judges, right? They make a judgment about what's in the public interest, but invariably, their own experiences, who are their friends, whether they live in a golf course or not, right? Those sorts of things will affect their judgment.
The point of amortization is to essentially bring it down to zero, right? Like normally amortization is for like any tangible asset. So like,
right. It's to allow them to wind their business value down all the way to zero. Give them time.
But then I could just ask the city to just buy whatever I have left.
But they won't. But see, amortization works. So they don't want to pay for it. If they want to pay for it, they pay for it tomorrow. Right. So let's say after 3 years they got to shut down your business. You still have some inventory. They're not buying it from you. You're on your own. Well, you think it's silly because you own a business, right? The neighbors in this community think it's not silly because they don't want to have an adult bookstore there.
For the record, I don't have a
I'm glad.
Yeah.
There's a thing called the internet. Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, that's kind of on your exam. You're giving us a time period that the amortization is expiring.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome.
If it's 90 days, it's probably too short.
So we
I
want to
think so.
are we going to argue in our analysis that any amortization that's
I think I don't want you to have to memorize the majority rule 90 states, but if there's a 90-day period, this one's going to be unreasonable under any standard.
doesn't have to be.
Well, I think 90 days is confiscatory. It's a taking, right? Making you shut down 90 days would become a confiscatory taking. All right. Questions in the first case? You see? Yeah. Good. Yeah.
But there's no definite monetary value. You're saying that there's no We shouldn't even include one.
Well, look, the majority says there's no bright line rule, right? Current says balancing, but there's never going to be a specific number that you have to pay, right? I mean, I guess if there was a confiscatory taking, look, what happened in this case? The court said this is a confiscatory taking. Did the city pony up the money to pay for the bookstore? Of course not. They just ignored it, and it's still there 40 years later. Right, it's still there. They don't ever want to actually pay for it, right? The government doesn't actually want. Remember, I said last week with the takings clause, there's this balance, right? Where the property owner says, "Okay, it's a taking, pay me," and the government says, "There's no taking, I won't pay you," right? Anytime a court says to the government, "If you take it, you have to pay," they say, "Okay, never mind, we don't want it anymore. Never mind, we don't want it." It happens every single time because they don't want to pay because it's money. I mean, it's also taxpayer dollars, right? The money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. The township can't print, dollars like the United States government can. Right? They have to get it from somewhere.
I know the amortization, but transitioning into variance, could they have that's what variance even though
Right, but they wouldn't need a variance because when they built it, it was lawful. Right. The key point here was they changed the zoning law after they opened the business.
So with the non-conforming, changing it after you have to apply for the variance?
There's no need for a variance here because they were complying with the law that exists at the time. They don't need a variance.
No, but I know, but let's say another business, the law changed.
Oh, are you? You're gonna make me something I don't want to say. So you're saying you need a variance to have an adult bookstore? What's your? Never mind. Just stop. Just don't. No matter what you say, display. My God. Yeah. You're gonna. I'm moving on. All right. This case, everybody get in trouble on. Everyone okay with this case? All right. The next topic I want to talk about is the variance. Okay. Make sure for your notes there are two distinct concepts: variances and special exceptions. They're very different and serve very different purposes. Do not confuse them. You will on the exam, I promise you, but a quarter of you will confuse them in the exam. I'm giving you due notice to not do that. All right, so a variance is designed for unforeseen hardships, right? A variance is designed for unforeseen hardships, things that the legislature never thought about, right? Very specific situations that really were not anticipated. And in order to obtain a variance, you need to show generally two things. The first is that there is some undue burden or undue hardship, right? Some undue hardship. This is going to be a really big hardship, not something trivial, but basically you can't even use the land, right? And the classic example is your lot is too small, right? And you can't build on it, anything. A variance might be used to allow you to build on a lot that's otherwise too small. But again, that's be very bad. Think of the strict necessity standard for an easement, a quasi easement. Got to be absolutely necessary, not just, oh, it'd be nice to have a new patio built, right? No, that's not enough, right? Got to be an absolute hardship. And the second factor of getting a variance asks whether granting the variance would impact the public interest, would impact public good, would impact the comprehensive zoning plan. Is this bad for policy? Is this bad for the public? Right? Of course, this runs into Casey's question for a few moments ago. Who gets to decide what's in the public interest? Does the zoning board get to decide? Right? Does the legislature get to decide? Does the court get to decide? Who decides what's in the public interest? So again, variances are based on unforeseen, unexpected hardships. If this was something that you could anticipate in advance, the legislature, you're not going to get a variance. If this is just merely for convenience, you're not getting a variance. It's got to be a hardship that's very difficult. All right, what with me? All right. Yes.
So is this like the property equivalent of like a force majeure bond?
Explain more. I'm not sure I'm getting the connection.
Because you're saying that there has to be some sort of hardship.
Yeah, I mean, force majeure is much harder. I mean, force majeure, act of God, that's more than a hardship. That's like, a hurricane or a tornado comes in, right? That's something really bad. So I think it's not quite the same. All right. Anyone want to give me the facts in the New Jersey case? And by the way, it's Jersey, so you know what's going to happen. They're going to get rid of the normal rule. That's just, it's 100%. Anyone give me the facts here? You okay? Spelled. Facts, anyone? Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
All right. So here we've got, no, I don't want to give you the facts. All I wrote down was rules. I thought I made much more detailed notes on this one. I didn't.
Anyone? No one? All right, we'll skip the facts then. Right? I'm not sure if my back. Jay, go ahead.
I think somebody wanted to build a house, but his lot wasn't big enough to have the appropriate space between the street or something.
Right.
He applied for a variance, but they said they initially declined it because the board concluded that it wasn't undue hardship.
Yeah.
They appealed it.
Yeah, I actually got a comment in my last class in a little chat, and a little feedback. Do we have to know the cases in the notes? Yes, you do. I'm not doing this again. It's sort of frustrating, but yes, thank you, Sheila. It's very good. So this is a classic case of inutility. That's a word you may have not seen before, but inutility. I-N-U-T-I-L-I-T-Y. Inutility, right? If the zoning code requires your lot must be a certain size, right? And your land is just too small to fit it, you can't build. The land becomes basically worthless, right? You can't build anything. Again, it's zoned for one family house. Let's say one family house must be 3,000 square feet, and you only have 2,500 square feet to build on. You're stuck, right? You can't build. And keep in mind, X feet to the curb in front, X feet to the house on either side, right? So you have to have a buffer around it. This land can't be used. The property owner tried to fix it. He tried to acquire more land from the different neighbors, tried to buy land here, buy land there, and he couldn't. No one wanted to let him build. What is a person to do? So this is a classic case of a variance, right? He had a hardship. He literally could not build on his property. There's nothing he could build at all. He could not build anything on his property. So what did he do? He went to the government, asked for a variance. Now the zoning board denied it, right? And you might ask, wait a minute, Josh, how on earth can they deny a building permit, right, when he can't build on it, right? The variance, not deny permit, deny a variance when he can't even build upon it, right? The lower court really only thought about the neighbors, right, about the public good, right? But the court never actually explained how the public good would be impacted by having a house that's a little bit smaller. And this was, who asked me before this question? Actually, I think it's your question before. Who the heck says that 2,500 square foot is the right number, right? That's just a made up number. And if it's 2,400 square feet instead of 2,500 square feet, will anyone actually care? Will anyone actually ever know? You get a little tape measure and you measure the house and figure out how many square feet there are, right? Also, there were other houses in the neighborhood with the same size that were grandfathered in. This house didn't commit a nuisance, it didn't block light, didn't block air, it didn't block sunshine. Right, so there's really no evidence that this actually affects the public interest other than the fact that it's smaller. So I think this is the case where the zoning board just said no to everything because they didn't want things to change. I'll tell you this decision is rare. It's very rare that a state Supreme Court overrules a zoning decision. Usually it's defer all the way. Usually it listens to what the zoning board says. This case is very rare, but it's New Jersey and everything goes in New Jersey. That might be the only thing you remember this semester, that New Jersey everything goes. That'll be about it. You'll forget everything else I tell you. If you ever wind yourself up in New Jersey, you'll know what to do. Everything goes. Everything's legal in New Jersey. Okay. Questions on the Westwood case from New Jersey? All right. So what are some examples of why a variance might be granted? Again, the classic example is you can't build. Your lot's too small, the house is too big, you're over a line, and so on. Another example might be an actual hardship. So imagine a person suffers an accident, needs to build a wheelchair ramp. And those are actually pretty long to get clearance, right? And if you actually measure, the wheelchair ramp comes all the way up to the curb. That's too close to the curb, right? That is a classic case where you're going to grant a hardship variance. The person literally can't enter his house, right? The government will not make you crawl up the stairs in some inhumane fashion. A ramp will be appropriate. Okay. What happens if a buyer knows the lot's too small and buys it anyway? Generally, they can still apply for variance, right? It's still a hardship, so they can generally still apply. Okay. If there's a covenant and you knowingly buy it, right, you're subject to the law. But anyone can go to the government and seek a variance, right? Again, the idea of the variance is, yes, I know there's a hardship. Even if I screwed up, a court could hold it against you, right? You can apply for variance, you may not get it, right? In other words, you're not disqualified from seeking the variance. Just typing that like I put that for next year. Okay. All right. Everyone within the variance. All right. The next topic is what's called the special exception. In your notes, keep very distinct the difference between a variance and a special exception. A variance is designed for some sort of unforeseen hardship. A variance is designed for an unforeseen hardship. Special exceptions, the exact opposite. It's not based on a hardship, and it's for circumstances that the legislature anticipated. Again, the special exception is for circumstances the legislature anticipated. You are not basing yourselves on the mercy of the variance of the zoning board, right? It's a circumstance that was anticipated. Now, this one that gets a little bit tricky, though. There's no balancing. There's no equity involved with a special exception. It's based on almost a formulaic checkbox, where the legislature would say, if you meet circumstances A, B, and C, you get a special exception, right? If your building is a certain height and a certain width and a certain square footage, you can build in this area, right? Specifically, it lists certain factors that can be satisfied. If you meet those, you get it. But what cannot be done here? Okay. I got to pause and do a little bit of con law for a minute. Did you study in con law the non-delegation doctrine? Does this sound familiar?
We did.
Yeah, good. The other class didn't, right? So the idea of delegation is very basic, right? We have a separation of powers in our Constitution. Congress has the legislative power. Can Congress give some other department of government the power to make laws? No, right? The power to make laws belongs to Congress. And if Congress does give an agency the lawmaking power, it's unconstitutional. Now, we can argue forever what actually people don't even agree how it works. In the state constitution, it's a little bit easier, right? This doctrine case illustrates it. The zoning boards are local officials. They're generally not elected, they're appointed, and they cannot exercise legislative power. They cannot write zoning codes. All they can do is enforce the law given to them. Okay, so the variance law says you, the zoning board, can determine hardship in certain unforeseen circumstances, right? So we give the power to the zoning board to determine hardship for purposes of variances. All right. But with a special exception, the boards do not have discretion. With a special exception, things have to be automatic, right? You have to do very specific things. And if you do them, you get your special exception. And these special things are crafted by the legislature, not by the courts. If a zoning board exercises legislative power, they act ultra vires. I'll write this in the board for you. If a zoning board exercises legislative power, they act ultra vires, beyond the scope, not ultra vires, ultra vires, VIRES. They act beyond the scope of their delegated powers. Right? Why does this matter? Zoning boards cannot exercise legislative powers. Go with me. All right. Anyone want to give me the facts in the town of Brunswick case? Kirk?
So developer comes in, into a subdivision area and an apartment. We essentially wanted the exception, the building board, arguing that they mentioned the floor requirements.
Mhm.
essentially, And, the building board, argued that they couldn't, four. and they could pick up-
What were 2 and 4? Help us out here, Kirk.
Well, so four was that it would be.
How would an apartment complex endanger the public?
Maybe to open.
Do you think that's legit? A legitimate concern?
Probably.
In Brunswick, Maine, really crowded there? You can find it on a map. I mean, somewhere in that state, right? Maine's actually a very big state. Yeah. Right. So, and what was the second one? Just help us out with that last one.
They kind of interwove, but ultimately.
All right, very good. Thank you so much for that, Kirk. Right, so we have a problem here. The legislature enacted a 4-part test to determine if a special exception should be granted. Oh, by the way, special exception, also called conditional use permit, CUP. A special exception is also referred to as a conditional use permit. You'll see it both ways. Special exception, conditional use permit. Both ways you'll see it spelled. Again, the legislature enacted a 4-part test for the special exception. Right, factors 1 and 3 are kind of stupid. They don't really matter. But 2 and 4 are problematic. Right? Because 2 and 4 ask the board to determine what's in the public interest, what's in the general welfare, without any guidance. Right? There's no guidance to determine that. Legislature can't do that. With a special exception, they cannot delegate to the zoning board the power to determine what's in the public interest. It's up to the legislature to define the terms by which a special exception can be granted. Now, a student might ask, wait a minute, Josh, I thought for a variance, the second element is this going to affect the public interest, right? You're right. So with regard to a variance, the zoning board can consider the public interest. But with regard to a special exception, the zoning board cannot consider the public interest. Again, the variance is based on sort of unexpected hardships. So they give them more discretion. With a special exception, it's premised on a very expected mechanical checklist. And it's not up for the government, for the zoning board to make sort of judgment calls about hardship and the like. It's not up to the government to decide if something's in the public interest or not. This purpose of special exceptions be automatic. If you meet these criteria, check 1, 2, 3, you get your special exception. There is no checklist for variance. It's very subjective and it's very rarely overruled by courts. Likewise, with a special exception, there's not much discretion, but they're also reviewed differentially by the courts.
So was the developer's argument
Yeah.
based,
Trisha, thank you.
was the developer's argument based on the
Yes. Yeah, the argument was by the developer that this was a delegation problem, that the legislature cannot delegate to the zoning board the power to make judgment calls about what's in the public interest. That's up to the legislature to decide. Now, again, he wants to build an apartment complex in a residential area. He did not seek a variance because there's really no variance to build an apartment complex. There's no hardship. So you can only seek a conditional use permit. But this test was far too vague. Give too much discretion to the government. Okay, move on. Yes, Aaron, please.
When I read through this section in the case book, everything that the special exception said sounded like a variance. It was like almost like they were just.
You're right. Which is why I made that point very clearly. When you're talking about a variance, the government is allowed to consider hardship, is allowed to consider public interest. When you're seeking a special exception, they're not. It's a different standard for each. You're exactly right. All right, so don't confuse them. If you're talking about a special exception and using the word hardship, you're wrong. Right? If you're talking about a special exception, you're talking about public interest, you're wrong. Yes.
There's a question for today about special exception can be granted if the property owner demonstrates a substantial hardship. Can they make that? Can the legislature make special hardship underneath a special exception one of the check boxes?
No. No, this one's false. So question 6, a special exception can be granted if the property owner demonstrates substantial hardship. That's false, right? If one of the check boxes is there a substantial hardship, that's ultra vires, right? You cannot delegate that power for a special exception. You can have the exact same prong for variance, but you can't have it for special exception. It's almost the exact opposite of what you'd expect. Okay. How we doing here? Good. Questions on the special exception versus variance? Make sure you get those straight in your notes. Good. All right. The last topic for today is what's called spot zoning. Spot zoning. You want to give me the facts of the state of Rochester? That's Rochester, Minnesota, not Rochester, New York. Oh, go ahead, Alex. Zach. Try it again.
All right. So here we've got. I was visualizing this as kind of a cross piece of land between a couple of other lots. I did not.
Rochester, Minnesota, if you know, is where the Mayo Clinic is, very famous hospital. So that's what's going on here.
Sure. So we've got this vacant lot between a single-family subdivision, single and multi-family subdivision, and the Mayo Clinic, as well as it says a couple of blocks away, the central business district. So again, I'm visualizing a sort of T-shaped stretch of nothing. It's a vacant lot. So we've got a developer who would like to put a 49-unit luxury condo in. But the city doesn't want the city does want that to occur. And to do that, they passed an ordinance rezoning that tiny stretch of property rather than issuing variance. The city council, the owners of the neighboring homes didn't care for this. They liked their quiet neighborhood that didn't have a giant set of condos in it, and they attempted to stop this. And the court held that the court held that a rezoning classification must be upheld unless the government proves that the classification is unsupported by any rational basis related to the promoting of public health, safety, morals, or general welfare, or if the classification amounts to taking it up.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Zach. All right, so this is a case where there's allegations of what's called spot zoning. All right, so generally we think that zoning must be based on this sort of comprehensive plan where everything is done in cohesion, thoughtfully, deliberately, intentionally. This neighborhood's residential, this neighborhood's commercial, everything's going to be in perfect harmony. What happens when the government doesn't act according to a comprehensive plan? They just pick one block at random and say, okay, we'll make this one mixed use, right? The suspicion is that this is being done for inappropriate reasons. Perhaps here, because their wealthy developers want to build something and bring a lot of property taxes to the area. So the allegation is this is an instance of spot zoning. Why is spot zoning bad? Because all government action must have some rational basis, right? You can't just act arbitrarily. This is like picking a number of a hat and executing someone. We talked about last week. But here, the rationale is higher property values. Is obtaining higher property values a rational basis? You bet it is. Can a government make a decision for the sole purpose of keeping property values high? You bet it can. Courts have upheld this forever, right? When they say maintain the character of a neighborhood, a characteristic of the neighborhood, what they mean is money, right? Who are the people living there? How much money are they paying? So the courts have long held that maintaining property values is a rational basis, and here the court uses a rational basis standard and upholds the zoning of this one block. Casey. What do you mean money can't be the only reason?
Like, because like, rational basis, because like being involved in this right here, like property taxes, like they're gonna make more money. Like that can't be sold.
Oh, wait till next class. You'll see lots of cases saying exactly that. I'll give you an example, right? So economic protectionism. Let's say I want to sell a casket, a wooden box, right? I'm not putting people in the box. I'm just selling these wooden boxes. Do I need to be a licensed mortician to sell a wooden box? Do I need to learn how to embalm people, how to cremate people, and so on? No. But our good friends in Louisiana had such a law. They said that if you want to be if you want to sell a casket, which is a wooden box, you must be a licensed mortician. And this went through the courts, right? And the precedent seems to suggest that the reason for this was to protect the funeral parlor business, right? The licensed morticians. Give me another example. Do you need a government license to be a florist? We're talking about arranging flowers here, right? In Louisiana, yes, in fact, you did need a license to be a florist. If you want to work at Kroger or whatever, to arrange flowers, you got to be a licensed person, right? The reason is we need to protect the florist industry, right? Eyebrow threading, right? There's take a little, pull out the eyebrows. You need to be a licensed cosmetologist to pull thread eyebrows. They don't even have training on eyebrow threading in cosmetology class. Okay, so lots of laws exist to protect industries, protect value. This whole person protecting value, right? That's money. And these courts consistently upheld on a rational basis. So yes, not all courts reach that conclusion. That's usually the majority rule. Some courts go otherwise. I hate to say it, but this sounds like Lochner, doesn't it? Yeah, Kelso doesn't like Lochner. He and I don't agree on that one. Randy, like, ooh, Lochner, ooh, it's like Beetlejuice, right? Don't say it too many times. Lochner will come back and haunt us from the grave. Yeah, it's basically Lochnerism, right? Can the government take action to, protect unions or harm unions? But there's a lot of precedent going back decades saying that the government can regulate zoning to maintain property value. And they'll use a euphemism like a characteristic of the neighborhood, but we're talking about property values here. Right? Well, the case next week where they regulate the colors of buildings or the shapes and sizes of buildings, what things look like, right? And the purpose is not because it's pretty, but they want to maintain property values. And that's enough of a rational basis. So because there's a sufficient basis to do this, the court upholds under a very deferential tier of scrutiny. Yes? Oh, I had a hand up. Questions on spot zoning. It's going to be very rare to find a case where this actually succeeds, because almost there's always a reason why the government's doing it that's not the real reason, and that's good enough. I mean, what rational basis means is it doesn't even matter if that's the real reason, but there's some reason that you could be using that's good enough. You look at Williamson v. Lee Optical, right? Sounds familiar. Cases like that. True rational basis means even if you're making something up in court, and that was never the reason why you did it, the court will retroactively graft that rationale to the original decision. That's what rational basis standard means. Not a fan. For Kelso and I don't agree. We don't agree. We agree on lots of things, but not common law. Those things we tend to disagree on just about everything. Yeah. Yes. Nisa. I mean, primary. It's a very good question the way you framed it. I think the primary purpose of this zoning was to allow these wealthy developers to build condos near the Mayo Clinic. But yes, if you ask in court, they'll say we're trying to maintain we're trying to have mixed use, which will improve the property and provide opportunities for people to live there and so on. Right? They'll just make up something. There's nothing primary. There's no clear test here. I'm sorry. I do appreciate you asked though. What else? Don't you miss covenants? Wasn't that easier? At least there were rules there. I could teach you the covenant rules, vertical privity. There were rules there. Here, there's no rules. We're in common law land, just whatever goes. All right. Let me wrap up. We're basically done. That last discussion goes pretty quick. All right. Let me wrap up, and I'll let you out of here in a few moments. We're talking about zoning. We have to keep in mind a few principles about flexibility. One of which is amortization. When you have these prior non-conforming uses, you generally have grandfather status, but even if you don't have grandfather status, you must have some period to wind down, which must generally be of sufficient length or reasonableness. But at least in Pennsylvania, there's a bright line rule, and no period suffices. Variances are premised on unexpected hardships, and the board can consider those hardships along with the public interest. But special exceptions, these are very clear mechanical problems that have been anticipated by the legislature that cannot give much discretion to the board. So again, for variances, yes, you have discretion. For special exceptions, there's really no discretion. Yep, we good? All right, I'll turn the exit poll on. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.